What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 4 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and we are officially at the halfway point of this giant, extravagant season. And I think of all 4 episodes so far, I probably liked this one the most because it at least included 2 scenes that were reminiscent of Tolkien's text, which is a rare, precious, beautiful thing in a show that is largely invented from scratch. Or maybe it's just because this episode did not have any Harfoots in the plot, and as I've said in previous videos, I think the Harfoots and the Stranger are by far the weakest part of the show. But in that, my whole philosophy for this channel in general is to try to steer people towards really good stuff. I feel a little guilty that I always come across as like this sad, depressed person when I'm reviewing this show. Some people even gave me comments on Twitter about how I didn't seem angry about the show. I just seemed kind of sad and demoralized, and I apologize for coming across that way. So 2 quick things that are on a more positive note. Yesterday, I started reading this book, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It's one of those giant fantasy tomes that has been getting recommended to me for years, and I've been avoiding it because it's the size of a doorstopper. But it's one of those books where after a few sentences, I was like, oh my God, I see what people are talking about. You just fall under its spell almost immediately. So to everyone out there on this channel who has recommended this book in the past, thank you. You were 100% right. And as I've said before, with all these giant fantasy shows running right now, it is my genuine, sincere hope that it will lead to more people reading the great fantasy books of the past, present, and future. And this, I think, came out in 2008, so relatively modern if you're looking for something a little bit more current. And the other positive thing I wanted to mention is the latest episode of my podcast, Wrong Reel, where we celebrate the fantasy classic Highlander from 1986. If you are a fan of that film, you will absolutely love the roundtable discussion of that movie. And if you have not yet seen Highlander from 1986, go do so. It fucking rocks. But before I get to my official review, I do want to go over one piece of news. I found this fascinating article by Sean McNulty from his September 14th edition of The Wake Up, which is, I guess, an ongoing part or segment of the website The Ankler. And he was talking about how in this culture war of Rings of Power versus House of the Dragon, that measuring the numbers and measuring the performance is far more complex than just keeping track of total minutes watched. Because people have to keep in mind that neither Amazon nor HBO sell advertising based on minutes viewed like a traditional network. And that while it might be fun for people on YouTube to talk about like this very heated rivalry between the 2 fandoms and the 2 shows and the 2 platforms, in the end, Amazon and Warner Brothers Discovery, they really make their money from subscriber growth or the loss thereof. So it's really hard to know what those numbers are because they control access to them, and we only know what they choose to tell us. And oftentimes the numbers that they choose to tell us are unable to be verified by third-party sources. In any event, he explains it all much better than I could. So if you're curious to read a real down and dirty article that really gets into the meat of this rivalry, I definitely recommend the work of Sean McNulty. But let's get into this episode. I hope that now that a week has passed, everybody's recovered from the post-traumatic stress and their nightmares after watching that really strange slow-motion horse riding sequence in episode 3. And I think at a minimum, I think this episode will be encouraging to people because at least there's some progress with the plot. It wasn't fast-paced. It wasn't, an exhilarating experience by any stretch of the imagination. But at a bare minimum, this episode presented us with the looming threat of the total, complete destruction of Numenor, which is a major part of Tolkien lore. And I think of all the shots in this show so far, that vision we see at the beginning of the episode with all the water rushing in, I mean, if you're wondering where the budget for this show was spent, it's spent on shots like that because those special effects were next level. But speaking of pacing, I want to push back on one thing I've been reading online where I've seen a lot of people saying it's not that this show is slow, but it's that Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King, those were slow and always bad as well. And it's a weird thing now where when people are expressing frustration with a show or a movie, they'll say, oh no, it's not that the Book of Boba Fett sucks, it's that Boba Fett has always sucked, which is a really weird way to defend something that you're into. And I'll just simply say that I disagree. Fellowship of the Ring is absolutely riveting. And I had one person on Twitter say that 90% of the film is just people walking through fields, which is complete and total bullshit. Maybe there's about 90 seconds of people walking through fields, but it also has battles galore and incredible lore and really dynamic camera work and exhilarating photography and soaring music. And so for everybody out there who's trying to defend this show on the merits as you perceive them, as opposed to trying to tear down the greatness of movies like The Fellowship of the Ring, which for me is probably the best live-action Tolkien experience we are ever going to get. And because I love the books of Tolkien so much, you can see them over my left shoulder, as well as my love for a lot of the animated adaptations, as well as some of the live-action adaptations. I have decided to ride this show out to the end because I hope we'll continue to see more scenes like when Elrond's describing the background of his father Arendil. And that's a very condensed, very simplified version of the story of Arendil, but at a minimum, he didn't say anything that was incorrect, and that was very refreshing to my ears. So if the show can continue to throw me a bone like that from time to time, that will definitely help keep me on the hook. But let's get into the nuts and bolts of this episode itself. We're finally introduced to the son of Pharazôn, a character named Kemen, and he seems to be romantically interested in Elendil's daughter. But the initial main brewing drama in Numenor is the fact that a lot of people feel like the arrival of an elf means that all the jobs and all the opportunities are going to go to elves, and it was kind of a clumsy, weak scene that was poorly written, that was trying to show the growing anti-elven sentiment amongst many Numenorians. And while the anti-elven sentiment amongst Numenorians comes straight from Tolkien, nonetheless, it could have been handled much better. And I noticed this strange trope that the show keeps using. Anytime they're describing the people that Halbrand comes from, they describe them as scattered, leaderless, with that exact inflection. They used it last episode and this episode. And it's the exact figure of speech, or nearly the exact figure of speech, which Hugo Weaving used as Elrond to describe humans back in Fellowship of the Ring.
A scattered, divided, leaderless.
And I think the screenwriters of the show need to do a better job of at least disguising when they're ripping phrases from better adaptations of Tolkien. And then there's another really clumsy scene where Galadriel threatens to go over the Queen Regent's head and go straight to her father to make her request, and she roars that there is a tempest in me. And as great and as iconic and as legendary a character as Galadriel might be, in the text, sadly, this character continues to be frustrating on the screen. And another source of frustration for me is the character of Isildur, who has all these dreams of possibly going west to Valinor, and we see him deliberately sabotaging work on his ship and accidentally getting some of his friends dismissed from the ship. And it seems like even though Isildur is one of the most important figures in all the history of Tolkien, this show hasn't really figured out what to do with him yet, or at least at a bare minimum. They haven't quite figured out what to do with him until he pledges at the end of the episode to join his father and the Queen Regent and Galadriel as they all sail east to Middle-earth. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, but one of the more interesting confrontations this episode was between Arondir and Adar, who's this scarred elf, or at least he's got all this kind of messed up scar tissue on the left side of his face, and he's making all these ambiguous references to how he's not a god yet, as if somebody that he's serving might possibly turn him into one. But he frees Arondir and tells him to deliver a message to his old watchtower. Now, when it comes to elves going over to Sauron or Morgoth, it's very, very, very rare for an elf to do anything remotely evil. Even the most fucked up kinslayers of the elves, like the elves that were the sons of Feanor, who murdered a hell of a lot of elves while pursuing the Silmarils that their father created, even they were opposed to Morgoth and Sauron and fought them to the bitter end. And so I guess maybe the one elf that I'm aware of in all of Tolkien's literature who actually did some evil things was this character Maeglin, a dark elf who plays a large role in the Fall of Gondolin, which is the Fall of Gondolin is the event that got me curious to read the Silmarillion in the first place. But I hope they will find a way to really earn Adar's reputation as an evil elf, because in Tolkien's literature it's basically impossible for elves to go completely over to the dark side unless it is committing atrocities against their own people, as was the case with the Kinslayers, the sons of Feanor. But that's another story from another day, because that all comes from the First Age, and this show's not tackling the First Age at all. And we also get a few decent scenes with young Theo this episode. There's a big problem at the Watchtower where there's a shortage of food, so he decides to go home, and he brings that evil blade, or the hilt of that evil blade, along to defend himself. And there are a bunch of orcs that are looking for it. And basically, if you stab it into your wrist using your own life force or blood, it forms a blade and allows you to use it as a weapon. And those scenes were okay, but I guess the more interesting scene is when he meets this old dude back at the guard tower, or the watchtower, who shows that he has similar scars, and he asks the boy whether or not he's ever heard the name of Sauron. I'll be curious to see if and how many of these humans at that tower decide to go over to the other side, because, as it turns out, Arondir's message is that everyone in the region must swear fealty over to the dark side. And in terms of action, we got to see Arondir in what I would describe as a decent action scene, but this show really over-relies on extreme slow motion and elaborate acrobatics. And obviously, everybody loves watching Legolas do his thing back in the original trilogy, but I feel like Arondir's scenes might be more effective and more intense if they were allowed to play out in real time. I mean, obviously, it's hard to show somebody catching an arrow and knocking it and firing it back, but imagine if you did see that in real time, you'd be like, holy shit, that guy's such a fucking badass. But Arondir remains my favorite character to the show. I hope they'll continue to put him to good use, but I hope we'll at least get one action scene where we get to see him do his thing in a real time. But as far as the Elven and Dwarven characters are concerned, it remains unclear what this giant project is that Celebrimbor is working on with the dwarves, but I'm assuming it's going to be a giant forge for the creation of the Rings of Power. But we get a minor little subplot when Celebrimbor mentions to Elrond that his father Arundel once said that his future would be in his son's hands. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but at any rate, Arendel's like a star or a constellation at this point, so whatever his future might be, it's fine, it's secure. But we get a lot more scenes down in Khazad-dûm where we see that Durin is hiding something or avoiding Elrond. And so Elrond does a little digging and finds this secret passage where Durin swears him to a vow of secrecy because they have discovered Mithril. And Durin's father has said that it's too dangerous to mine, but Durin ends up giving Elrond a little piece of it. Right before there's this giant cave-in on top of 4 dwarves, and luckily Durin survives, but his father does insist that it gets sealed off again. And Durin has a little bit of a temper tantrum, but Elrond encourages him to make amends because his father's old and time with him is short. But the main thrust of this episode is everything that happens after Galadriel breaks free from her guards, throws them in her cell, and scales the tower up to see the father of the Queen Regent. And she wants to know why that they turned on the elves when he used to be so loyal. And the Queen Regent shows her the Palantir, where she also sees a vision of the end of Numenor. And the Queen Regent says the official vision, the beginning of it, it begins with the arrival of Galadriel. And Galadriel asks her to fight along the elves once again. And initially the Queen Regent's very resistant, but as Galadriel's about to leave, the petals of the white tree start to fall. They are the tears of the Valar, as they say, and the Queen Regent and Elendil, they share a look, and she realizes that this is an ominous sign of impending doom. So instead, she decides that the Queen Regent will be escorting Galadriel back to Middle-earth with an army, and Isildur volunteers, and a lot of other people volunteer. So while the means by which the Númenóreans came to the decision to go back to Middle-earth is quite different from Tolkien's text, because in the text, they're just mariners and explorers, and they like to explore the world, and they like to increase their wealth and their fortune, and they like trading with the people of Middle-earth. In any event, this is going to get the Númenóreans going back to Middle-earth, which all leads to an inevitable confrontation with Sauron. So at least we are moving things along towards some conflict. Because what this show needs at this point, we are more than 4 hours deep into the story, is just some giant seismic events where you can say, holy shit, I'm so glad I've invested all this time into this show. And I know a lot of people will argue that we have to be loyal to shows like Wheel of Time or Lord of the Rings of Power so that the shows can keep going, giving them more opportunities to get things right. But my attitude is that life is very short, and you should not have to endure an entire season or 2 seasons to finally get to the good stuff. I know there are a lot of shows out there. People say, "Oh, you gotta endure the first 2 shitty seasons to get to the good stuff." When you're spending $1 billion on a show, you need to put your best foot forward from the word go. So right now, if I were to describe the show to somebody who's not seen an episode yet, I would say that it is big and beautiful, but bland and generic. It's neither bad nor good. It's just kind of forgettable, or at least it would be forgettable if it were not so expensive and not playing around with the beloved literature of a very famous writer. But at a minimum, there were, like I said, 2 scenes this episode that were reminiscent of the text of Tolkien, so maybe that's a sign that they're starting to pivot into more interesting terrain. But it's nearly 2 in the morning here in New York, and I am exhausted, so I'm going to wrap this video up. But I can't thank you for watching. If you weren't completely, totally bored to death or demoralized by this kind of depressed, sad rant about the state of this show, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But if you want to watch a much more positive video by J.R.R. Tolkien that I made last week, where I count down my top 10 favorite scenes and works of art and animated moments based upon the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, I'll leave a link in the description below. But I can't thank you for watching the video, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.